Welcome to the Diversity Connector podcast, where we explore the rich tapestry of human experiences. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and together as we dive into conversations that bridge cultures, challenge stereotypes, and celebrate the unique perspectives each of us brings to the table. Each episode is a journey through stories and insights from a kaleidoscope of voices, each sharing their colorful narrative. Whether you're at home, on the go, or just anywhere in between, you're now part of a community that values understanding, inclusivity, and the beauty of diversity. So plug in your headphones, get comfortable, and let's connect through the power of our shared stories. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on the Diversity Connector podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Diversity Connector. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today I am blessed with the presence of yet another amazing, amazing woman. I actually feel like I've met a sister from another mother. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, and share your story with us today.
Gertrude, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. I feel blessed that we have connected. I, like you, feel very much like we are sisters from another mother. It's amazing the connection we've had just in the short time that we've known each other. I am in Athens, Georgia, home of the University of Georgia, where I taught for 33 years. I'm a lawyer. I taught law in the College of Business, the Terry College of Business at the University of Georgia, and I retired in February of 2021. I have since retiring continued my diversity work. My main areas were legal studies of all sorts, business studies. But very early on, in fact, what brought me into teaching in the first place was employment law, which in our country is mainly it's mainly about employment discrimination based on Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, gender, and national origin. And my personal story is that I was a lawyer, a labor lawyer, working for the Federal Labor Relations Authority in Washington, D.C., where I grew up. The authority is the agency that handles federal labor law issues. And the authority itself, the administration of the authority is 3 members. And I was walking down the hall one day when one of the members stopped me and asked me if I would come to his office. I couldn't imagine why he wanted me to do that. I didn't really know him. I knew of him, of course, because he headed the agency, but I didn't know him. So I couldn't imagine what he wanted. And as it turned out, when I got there, he asked me if I was interested in teaching. And I said no. And he asked me if I was interested in moving south to the south of the United States. I'm not sure how much you know, but the south of the United States has a really awful, and certainly at that time still did, a really awful history regarding race and Black people. So that is not a place I would have wanted to move to. So I said no. And I had 2 daughters at the time, 2 little kids, and 2 and 4 years old. So it occurred to me that I was talking to the head of the agency, and I did have 2 children that needed to be fed, as I did. So I thought I better come up with a yes at some point. His next question was whether he could send my resume, along with that of other people who worked in the agency, to his old boss, who was now living in Florida. They were looking for a position for a course that he was interested in having taught. As it turns out, his old boss had been the head of the Public Employee Relations Commission in New York. And while he was there, one of the things that he noticed as head of the agency was that when unfair labor practices were brought, they were routinely ignored if they involved race or gender. He didn't know what to do about that. So when he retired and moved to Florida, he started teaching at the University of North Florida in their College of Business. And it occurred to him that he might have an opportunity to do something about this at that point. So he asked the department chair if he could have a course developed in these issues that he thought were very important and needed to be addressed. He got permission for it. And when he did, he reached out to his old assistant, who was now the head of the Federal Labor Relations Authority, the person I was talking to, and asked him if he knew of anyone who might be interested in developing such a course. Nobody had ever heard of such a course before, and certainly not in a college of business. And he was on the hunt to find somebody that might do it. Of course, the normal thing you would do is go to somebody who works at a place like the Federal Labor Relations Authority, because it's a bunch of labor lawyers and you expect that they would know what to do about employment law, which was sort of the working name for what they were calling, what they were trying to come up with. I was not the least bit interested in doing this. I had taught for years in just sort of in and out in, mentoring kids and teaching when I was in law school and stuff, but never thought of it as a career. Wasn't interested in having it as a career. I was enjoying being a lawyer. And they ended up choosing my resume out of those that they had been sent. And when they asked me to come and interview in Jacksonville, Florida, it was December of 1981. It was very cold in DC. And I decided to take a trip to go to warm Florida. And as it turns out, it was 80 degrees there as opposed to 30 or 40 degrees in DC. And more importantly, it ended up that the cost of living was substantially lower. Not only was there no state income tax, but the cost of things like housing and daycare, groceries was like almost half of what it was where I was living in DC. So it occurred to me that this might actually be a good idea. I had no guidance other than what I've said about what the course was supposed to be. Because nobody had ever taught such a course, it wasn't like I had anything to look at to figure that out. So I was on my own with the only sort of guidance coming from the person who taught labor law, who literally growled at me, "Don't touch labor law." Okay, so now I know what I'm not supposed to do, and I know that there's something about discrimination against blacks and women, or on the basis of race and gender, but I'm really not sure what that means. I had, when I came out of law school, I clerked for the first Black female to be appointed to DC's highest court. In fact, the first one to be appointed to any court of last jurisdiction in the country, the Honorable Julia Cooper Mack. And I had been on law review in law school, and I had also worked at the White House. And I understood how valuable research was. And, it was where I lived. So the idea of how to figure out what this course should be was one that I ended up researching. And the more research I did, the more I realized that it was about Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And I think I was sort of struck by that because it was now 1982 by the time I got there. I had gone originally for the interview in December of 81. I began working in June of 82. And I couldn't imagine that the law had been in place almost 20 years and nobody knew what this was. In fact, when I got the offer to go, I went back to the office and I said to all of the labor lawyers there, they want me to teach something they're thinking of calling employment law. Does anybody know what that is? And everybody was like, nope, I have no idea what it is. So I really was on my own and astonished to find out that it was really what we were talking about was a law that was almost 20 years old that had virtually sat there for all intents and purposes. People in the workplace didn't know, labor lawyers didn't even know what it was. And I was supposed to teach it to people who would later go into business, these business students. So I did. And it was a really successful class. But at the end of that first year of teaching, I got to the end of the year and realized that in the summertime, I don't teach. And because of that, I would not have any money. And again, I had children to feed. So I went to my colleagues and I said, what do you all do in the summertime for your income? And they said, oh, well, we save all year long. And I said, it would have been nice if you had told me that when I was first hired, because I did not know that. I was used to getting a check every 2 weeks. I all of a sudden was not going to have any money. And because I had moved, of course, I had used a lot of extra money that I probably would have saved otherwise because of that move and getting settled in a new place. So I was sort of on my own at loose ends about what to do. And somebody said, well, why don't you go over to executive education or continuing education? And I said, what is that? And they said, well, they, hold seminars for people in the community as opposed to the people who are here as students. And maybe you can create a seminar or something, and it might get you enough money to tide you over for the summer. I went over, I asked about it. They said, sure, we're interested in doing that. What do you teach? And I told them, and they said, okay, we'll come up with a brochure. And I'm like, a brochure? I'm a lawyer. I'm not a PR person. I don't know how to do that. And they said, well, we know nothing about what you teach, so maybe you better figure it out. So I did. I figured it out. And the course ended up being one of their most successful offerings ever. It was a one-day seminar on employment law. And it always was full. It always had a waiting list for it. And the more important thing for me, though, the thing that ended up creating sort of what I ended up doing with my life about these issues is that as I talked to people, these were people who were in the community who were working every day at jobs, and they came in for this one-day seminar. And as I talked to them, it became really interesting to me how the conversation always got back around to what was happening in their workplace. They always had some sort of question about some issue of discrimination that was going on. And as we talked about it, I realized I got to get into their heads about how they were making these decisions that would result in potentially liability for the corporation they were working for. And as it turned out, that led me on a journey to realize how important it was what we carry in our heads. That is, that's what the decisions are made on the basis of, not the fact that I tell you you're not supposed to discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, gender, or national origin, but how you come to the decision about what you're going to do with this employee who's in front of you in the first place. And you're never thinking, I'm going to discriminate against that person. So as over the years, I thought about how to deal with this in an effective way to prevent the employee from ever getting to the point where they would be sued. It turned into what we now know today as diversity. And diversity became diversity and inclusion, and then diversity, equity, and inclusion, and now diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. 12 years after I first started teaching that course, I came out with the first, from McGraw-Hill, the first ever textbook in employment law for business. It was sort of hard to get the publishers to sort of go with me on the idea that this was a book that was really needed, until the Hill-Thomas hearings. And of course, from their point of view, there were no courses in it. So why in the world would they publish a book? I kept saying, if you publish the textbook, people will create the courses. Well, that's not how business works. But then the Hill-Thomas hearings hit. And in one day in our country, Clarence Thomas was being considered for the U.S. Supreme Court, our highest court in our country. And Anita Hill was a person who had worked with him before, who was now a law professor in Oklahoma. And someone had told the Senate committee that was holding the hearings, the Judiciary Committee, that there had been activity on his part when he was her boss that should be investigated. They should at least hear about it from her. She did not want to testify. She ended up doing it anyway when they told her that if she did not, that they would just go with what they had, which of course she did not want to have happen. She wanted to, if you're going to tell my story, it should come from me, not from something that you've heard. And she ended up testifying, and it became a huge baptism by fire for sexual harassment for our country. It was the first time it really came out like that. And immediately employers got what I had been trying to say all this time. That is, they understood the importance of the issues that were involved in employment law. And by Monday, this was on a Saturday, and by Monday, we had competing offers on our desk. I have a co-author, Laura Pincus Hartman. We had competing offers on our desk from publishers who totally wanted us to do this book and wanted to have a big section on sexual harassment. That's how the employment law book was born. From that book, which was first published in 1994, came a whole discipline, employment law discipline. And the textbook became #1, and it has been #1 for the next 29 years. It'll be 30 years next year, in 2024. And and when I say it became a whole discipline, people were delivering papers about it, and it became a really important piece of how businesses did business. And from the summer course for me, I understood very early on that a huge piece of what I had to deal with was what was in people's heads. And that became eventually diversity, like I said, and now diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. I also, years later, ended up sitting on the first ever International Standard Organization's task force on diversity. They decided to have an international standard on diversity. It started off as just what would we do? What requirements would we want for a chief diversity officer? 10 years later, by the time it actually was put out in 2021, it covered every single aspect of diversity imaginable, from top to bottom. I served on that task force for the first 3 years, and it went from, what do we want for the skills to be for the chief diversity officer to everything. And it went from diversity to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. This is ISO 3415. So the move to how I ended up doing something like practical diversity, which is what I call my approach to doing this, where I deal with all of it, but it's really the individual and how the thoughts come up that lead us to discriminate in the first place, or treat others differently that may not be like us, may not be familiar to us. That came from developing the course. So through the course of the summer course, leading to diversity. So we have both employment law and diversity, and that is what I have been doing for the last 41 years.
Wow, Ms. Dawn, just listening to you speak and what you've contributed to this space is just absolutely incredible. It's just amazing. So can you explain the concept behind practical diversity?
Yeah.
The approach and how it differs from other DEI initiatives?
Yeah, and it actually is very different than the usual thing that we're used to thinking about when we think about diversity, because my approach really understands that there are systems at work, right? Things like systemic discrimination and the sort of formal parts of how people are treated differently. That is, that there are all sorts of rules and regulations that can have a different impact on one group than another without even intentionally trying to do it. I deal on the individual level. And for me, I don't come in, there are people who do this, but I'm not that person. There are people who come in and say, you should have this kind of program, you should have that kind of program if you want diversity, if you want to deal with diversity issues. I don't do that. I deal with people's hearts. I deal with what's in their head and how they make decisions in the first place about how they treat people in a workplace. And when I say how they treat people, I'm talking about the entire process of how you treat someone, because we can have rules and regulations at the top. We can have all sorts of things that tell us how we're supposed to be in a workplace, what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to conduct ourselves. It's another thing to sit at your desk and have to deal with the person who's next to you and how they treat you or how your boss treats you. That happens on an individual basis. I don't know of any corporation of any substance that has a policy that specifically says we are going to discriminate against this group of people. Yeah. But if you look at their numbers, routinely, they look like they're out of whack. Somebody's not being treated the same somewhere along the line. I say it's not the policy that you have that's doing that. It's the individual. When somebody goes to look to see who gets promoted, who gets hired, who gets raises, who gets training, who gets disciplined, it's interesting who those people tend to be. And to me, it makes sense that certain groups that had been traditionally not dealt with in this, at least in this country, the U.S., would be at the bottom end of that scale, because if you have learned over millennia, in fact, pretty much the entire history of our country, and it is specific to us, if you have learned to treat certain groups certain ways, then there are going to be certain outcomes from that. And passing a law in 1964 is not going to change that overnight. It's not even going to change it in 60 or 70 years, which is what we're still dealing with. So for me, dealing with people on the individual basis, having them figure out whether they treat certain groups differently based on whatever criteria is in their head, and letting them do the work of deciding that this is something they need to deal with in order to be in compliance with their employer is where I live. And I call that doing the hard work.
Yeah, I saw that you have a lot of resources on your website to do with the hard work. And you're right, it's the individual person who's making that decision. A lot of times you can have all the rules, the regulations, the guidelines on what you should be doing, but it's going back to one person at a time and getting them to reflect back on how they're being. That's amazing.
That eventually is where your policies are going to come from. The big decisions are nothing but made up of molecules, that sort of stuff. So to me, it's almost impractical to work at the individual level for some people who don't understand that. But the truth is that if you don't work with the individual level, you're not going to get any changes, because once they go to that diversity program that you've set up for them to take a part of, once they go back and sit in their office and they're still treating the person next to them in ways that are not desirable, that hasn't been really effective. I want to get you to think about you and how you specifically fit into that picture. And if the ways that you have been dealing with people are not consistent with your employer's good policies about how people should be treated, equitably, not discriminate, we love everybody and treat them the same, then you got some work to do.
I love that. Yeah. So with your background in law, how do you ensure that your DEI seminars are accessible and relatable to people at all levels?
Yeah. Actually, I have to say, at some point during a presentation, I have to say, yes, this is the lawyer talking to you about legal stuff that says, my favorite line, it's all about love. Because my sessions are so accessible until you can forget I'm a lawyer. Because to me, this goes past the legal stuff. That's part of what doing those seminars taught me. And let me give you an example of it. I had a graduate student who was graduating with her MBA, and she was very excited about an interview that she had. It was near the end of the cycle. She was going to be finding out whether she was going to get this job or not on a full-time basis, where she had been interning for a year. And she came to class on Tuesday, and she was really nervous because she was going to have the interview the next day, and we had a Thursday class. So on Thursday, the class asked her, she told us that she was going, and when she came back, we said, well, how did it go? And she looked sort of concerned. And of course, we're thinking she didn't get the job after all. You know, she's been there for a year. Well, she said she did get the offer. In fact, she got the offer and they could not praise her enough. They loved what she had done for the year that she had been with them. But for some reason, they didn't think she was like really feeling it. And she was talking to the person who had supervised her. So he finally said to her, I'll tell you how good you were. You were so good that if you had been a man, we would have offered you 50% more.
Oh.
Can you imagine? This, and if you had said to him right at that second, you know what you did was illegal, right? I mean, that absolutely violates the law. He would have been shocked because, of course, he thought he was giving her some sort of compliment.
Yeah.
But for me, the big piece is it shows us how he feels about the value of males as opposed to females. Yes. And in our country, you cannot do that. You can't have a different pay scale for males than you do women who are doing the same job. That is illegal to do. But in his head, and I'm sure it was not a policy of the company, they probably would have been appalled to know he did this. But in his head, what he was walking around with mattered. At some point, he learned, probably very early on, has been my experience, that women are different than men, that they are to be treated as less than.
Yes.
And he graduated, walked into a workplace, had a job, and when it was time for him to make these decisions, that's what he was operating with in his head. That's why that's so important for me to deal with.
So can you tell us more about how your heart work page works and how it assists individuals like this in understanding and addressing these race issues in the US?
Yeah. Probably the biggest tool that I use is something called cultural introductions. And it's a way of introducing people to what's in their heads that they have no real clue is there. It's also a very, it's individual and it's person driven and it's no stress to this at all, because my basic question is, what messages did you receive growing up about certain groups? So about race, about gender, and it could be anything, about clothing, about education, about socioeconomic status. And the truth is, we all have ideas about those, and those ideas start when we're really, really young. In fact, they start at the beginning when they dress us in a pink blanket or a blue blanket, because that's meant to give a message that we're a girl or a boy. My question has always been, what difference does it make for a newborn? Okay, why does anybody ever even care? Because are you going to treat them differently? And the truth is, yeah, they are. They're going to treat them differently based on males or females at birth. And it never stops. And those kind of messages go in the entire time we are breathing. And I'll show you how amorphous these can be, how absolutely without thinking about taking these messages in, you do it. One day I was taking my grandson, who is about to turn 13. I was taking him to the doctor, and we were stopped at a red light, and he said to me, Nana, where's your blessing bag? And I said, what, Christian? And he said, where's your blessing bag? And I said, tell me what you're talking about. And he said, there's a homeless person right there, stopped at the light, asking for money. Like, where's your blessing bag? And I said, Christian, I don't have a blessing bag. And he said, Nana, you don't have a blessing bag in your car? And I said, no, Christian. Christian had grown up his entire life with his mother having a blessing bag in the car that she would give to people on the side of the road like that. And in it would be a bottle of water, probably a toothbrush. She would have some crackers or something in there, and several other little things that to her were a way of showing that she cared about this person, but at the same time, she wasn't just handing out money to them. Well, it never occurred to Christian that his grandma would not have a blessing bag, because a blessing bag is what you're supposed to have in your car to give to these people, right? We do that about everything. And I love that piece because it's, what we end up feeling really good about is that I feel good that my daughter, brought up a kid who did that. And we think about the blessing bag, but the truth is, it's the idea that we would think about that or have that in our head and not even think it was a big deal because it's
Yes.
what we're used to and what we grew up with. So introducing people to what's in their head through the cultural introductions becomes
Yeah.
a really huge piece for people. It is
That's
amazing
amazing.
what comes out to them as they do this. So this isn't me telling you, you've got issues you need to deal with women or Black folk or whatever it is. It's you figuring it out on your own in ways that you had simply never connected with before. And my
No,
favorite with that was the guy who said he did not receive any race messages growing up. He had said that he had not received any messages, but at his age and where he said he was from, I knew that just couldn't be true. Actually, if he were born anywhere in that country, it wouldn't be true. So I said, are you sure you didn't receive any messages about race growing up? And he said, no, we didn't allow Black people to live in our town, so I didn't get any messages about race. And when everybody started laughing, he was frightened at first, and then he realized what he had said.
Oh my God.
And he started laughing too. But then he got really serious and he said, I feel awful because I'm about to retire, and I know that there are Black people that I have hurt my entire life through something that I didn't even know was in my head. So
Oh, wow.
just that very simple, no stress kind of exercise, you
Yeah.
end up having these delightful insights about all sorts of stuff that you never have thought about before. And I tell people up front, I want you to be thinking about this for the rest of your life until you take your last breath. Because the
Oh,
truth is, we've had an entire lifetime of trying to or taking in these messages without realizing it and
yes.
operating on the basis of these messages without realizing that that's what we're doing. So when the
Mm,
woman it's time for you to figure out whether she should be paid. Well, you had taken in the message that women weren't worth as much as men were. So of course you wouldn't pay her as much as a man would, right? Well,
oh my
no, 'cause
God.
you walk into a workplace, you got a different set of rules that you're operating with. And for me, it's not about trying to make people think a certain way. It's not about calling anybody racist or sexist or homophobic. What it's
Yeah.
about is trying to bridge that gap that there may be, and it may not be, but you get to choose between what you think you're doing, how you
Yes. And
think
what
you're
you're
treating
actually
people,
doing.
and what you're actually doing, or
Yeah.
what your employer wants you to do versus what you may be doing. That's a very different thing than saying, we're all racist, homophobic, sexist, and we need to fix that. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't assume that. I assume there are people who may not know that they're operating with certain things. And if they're people of goodwill, they want to.
Yes. And they would like to correct that if they
Yeah.
could. So, based on your experience, what are some of the unique challenges organizations are facing in implementing effective DEI strategies?
Yeah. I think I have been at this for the past 42 years. So
Mm,
for me, being able, I take a long view, and that's something that a lot of people can't say who deal with this. They weren't in it from the beginning when it didn't even exist. Plus, I
right.
come at it, from the point of view of the law. And that gives
Yeah.
me a very different perspective too, because all of it actually is geared to you don't want to get sued. But
Yeah.
during this 40-year period, we've also moved away from that as much, although it's absolutely still there in the background, to we really know we should be treating people better. And we got some
Yeah.
issues that we need to deal with. So for me, the sort of long view of it is that the problems that a corporation or any organization is dealing with in trying to come up with how to implement and really own diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging the way we would like for it to. Ultimately, we don't even know
Mhm.
what that picture looks like because we've never been there.
Yeah.
The problem ends up being one that to me is a growth problem.
Right.
When you're a little kid, you don't come out walking. You go through stages and eventually you get to that place. This is
Yes.
different. We are going in my country from being a country that for 400 years enslaved a certain group of people,
Mm.
treated women a certain way, to a country that wants to do better, that actually passed laws to deal with this sort of issue. So the
Mhm.
progress that we're making is not going to come full blown. You don't pass a law and the next day everybody says, okay, we'll do what we're supposed to now, because they don't even
Yeah.
know what the picture looks like, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
one of the things that has happened is that people were more interested, and I can understand why, in the idea of having programs to deal with this,
Right.
wanting to do research to see if there was a need. Don't even ask me if there's a need, okay?
It's
The
there.
whole analytics thing, and it's
Mm.
it's new, it's a new area, but the truth is, believe me when I tell you, it's happening. Whether you
Yeah.
can see it or not, it's happening, that there are differences. And all you have to do, I promise you, is look at your numbers. Who gets promoted, who gets the raises and all of that, who gets disciplined, who's at the top of your organization, who's not, who's missing from that, who's around your table making decisions in the C-suite, who's not. It is there, and it doesn't take a ton of information, a ton of research to figure that out. Having programs to deal with that, to address that, is not going to be the only way that you can address it.
Mm.
And what we did was sort of started with that and came back to what it was I knew from the beginning, right? So now the literature is talking about how, yeah, we used programs, but the truth is we still hadn't changed people.
Mm. Mm.
It's sort of a top down thing, and you need the top, but you
Yeah.
also need the bottom, because if people don't understand why they're being asked to do something, if they don't understand the need for it in the first place, if they think
Yes.
everybody's having the same experience, so they don't understand why you need some diversity training, or they think they're a good person, so they don't understand why you're trying to act like they're not by requiring
Mm.
diversity training, then they're not going to be with you.
No.
I
No.
went through 40
Oh.
years of teaching students in the South of our country, which had slavery as its main
Mm.
economic driver for hundreds of years. I deal with those
Mm.
students at the flagship institution for the state of Georgia, and I see them when they come into that class. I see them when they leave. They come in
Mm.
thinking one thing, they leave thinking something totally different, not because I indoctrinated them,
Oh.
but because I taught them, I showed them what was there, what was being done. They got to, on their own, explore where they were in that picture. And that is why
Yes.
their thought process changed. Not because I made them change. I don't care whether you change or not. I care what the law
Mhm.
requires you to do. And I want to
Yes.
make sure you're consistent with that. But I don't care what you think about, in your odd hours when you're not at work. So it's
Mm.
not about changing you, making you think a certain way. It's about teaching you so that you now know what you're dealing with and you can
Mm.
govern yourself accordingly. You can, just like people murder people every day, even though there's a law that
Yeah.
says you shouldn't, people will
The
always
murder.
discriminate.
Mm.
But at
The
least
tra-
now you know two things. One, what the law requires when it comes to that. And two, you know how you fit into that picture, and you can make an informed decision about whether you want to continue to do that or not. And they rarely say, yeah, I think I'll continue to discriminate like I was taught to do all my life.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what are some of the key elements do you believe that are essential in conducting effective sexual harassment training in the workplace?
Yeah. It sexual harassment is a special one for me, because
Mm.
I had been doing ever since that summer when I started the seminars back in '83.
Hmm.
I had started doing consulting because, people would come to the seminars and then want me to come to their workplace and stuff like that. And, as I told you, I didn't do it for that. I mean, I did it because what I wanted to do was make some money that summer. I had a job. I didn't need another job. But, once you see that people were missing, this information, it made sense for you to go out and give it if they ask you to. So one of the big ones was sexual harassment, but only after probably close to 10 years of me saying,
Yeah.
y'all, there's this thing called sexual harassment that is a sleeping dragon, because
Yeah.
people really haven't connected yet with what it is and what the law requires. And once the Hill Thomas hearings happened in our country, all of a sudden everybody knew. And I had to really think about how best to get people to understand what this was and how different it was from the way you thought things were all the time, and what you might be doing that was problematic. And the reason I say all of that is because initially it was a fight to get men, particularly, to understand that you couldn't just have whatever access you wanted to women anymore. The rules had changed.
It
The rules
changed.
had changed. But what I thought was unfair, but unavoidable, was that the rules had changed and they had not been taught what they needed to do under this new set of rules. So, and let me tell you, when I was in China, I went to China to give a speech once. And when I was there, I was talking to a woman who was a professor there. And she told me that on Tuesdays, the university shut down for teaching purposes, and instead, and everybody comes together to hear what happened in the legislature in the week before. And I sort of looked at her like, what? And she looked at me like, well, of course. How do you find out? And I realized we don't find out. I mean, if they did something, fine. If it comes up in the news, okay. If it's either relevant to me or it's not, I hear it or not. Well, she said somebody is responsible every Tuesday for making sure that every single person down to the most remote village knows what to do, because the legislature has now passed these laws. Well, we don't have Chinese, I call those Chinese Tuesdays. We don't have Chinese Tuesdays. Okay. We don't all know something at the same time in the same place, and we now move forward with that knowledge in our head. So sexual harassment was a really good example of that, because with sexual harassment, all of a sudden the Hill Thomas hearings happened, and men were supposed to conduct themselves a very different way than they had before, but they had no idea what that way was. And what as sad as we may think that is, and how maddening we may think that is, the truth is it had always been thus. This is the way folk had always done. We had not liked it, but it was the way things had always been done. And then all of a sudden somebody called a halt to it and said, you can't do that anymore. So the training that I did had to take that into consideration. It's really important to me when I'm doing presentations or trainings to make sure that I am where the people are so they can move forward with me, instead of everybody being in a different place. So I can't sort of walk into a room and assume we're all in the same place. I am sort of didactic in the sense that because I know we may not all be in the same place, I have to start it off in a way that takes where you are into consideration. So I very often would do it through things like fact patterns, where I would I would give a fact pattern, and then I would tell me what you would do with this. How do you think about this? What would be your response to it? And as they talked about what their responses would be, as far as I'm concerned, there are no wrong answers. There are answers that may get you into trouble, and there are answers that may not get you into trouble. And I have to set a very safe space for learning, so that you understand that there are no penalties for you saying something that I may tell you we need to think about a different way. When I did that, it really opened them up. And by telling the stories, the fact patterns were based on real cases. When they got to see the other side of it, and it was in a non-confrontational way, in the sense that, nobody was standing there accusing them of anything, but instead we were using this as a learning tool, they got it. The country is still struggling with that big time. That was back in 91 or so that the Hill Thomas hearings happened.
Yes.
And you see the Me Too movement came about years, decades later. So we're still struggling with this, but taking that long view, it makes sense that if we've been treating women a certain way for millennia, that we would not, especially understand we don't have these, Chinese Tuesdays, that it would take a while for all of us to get to the same place about it, because everybody's dealing with it in the ways that they know. Older men tend to have a very different way of dealing with this than younger men do, who grew up knowing that it was not a good thing to do. In fact, I heard somebody say to me when I called them out on something that they did, it was totally inappropriate. They said, "Oh, well, in my day, it was okay to do that." I said to him, it was never okay to do that. Women just didn't, in your day, probably feel strong enough to be able to tell you how inappropriate it was. But it's
So what advice would you give to upcoming DEI practitioners to make their programs more engaging and impactful?
I'm glad you use those two words, because engaging and impactful, because very often when I come into a space to do work for an organization, one of the things that they will tell me is that they may have had somebody in before to do it, because of course, they think programming is the way you go about this.
Yes.
And or the only way you go about this. It certainly has an important part in it, but it's not the only thing you need to do. But they'll say that they had somebody who, everybody was totally turned off after they left, or they sit there and nothing happens. And I'm like, I don't even understand that concept, because when we are dealing with a presentation, if I can't have some fun, I don't understand why we're here. I have never been able to understand why we cannot have fun and learn and have a huge impact at the same time. There's no reason for that. Why would I do that to you? I don't want to go through it. And I certainly don't want to be the one whose name is attached to having done that to you. So for me, I would say to people coming up wanting to do this, and there are a lot of people now. I cannot believe how this area has exploded. I'm delighted. But one of the sort of bad things, and I will deem it that has happened, one of the unfortunate things that's happened with this, is that because employers sort of, especially after what happened with George Floyd in our country, where he was killed and everybody wanted to do something all of a sudden about race issues. Part of what happened was they just sort of grabbed anybody, and I know because I've talked to those people. And if you looked like, if you were Black, I don't care what you were doing in the organization, we need you to handle diversity. Okay, we need to do something about that. Like somehow being Black meant that you knew diversity stuff. I've studied this and written and researched this for 42 years, for Pete's sake. Why should somebody walk into this knowing whatever they need to know about diversity? But I have to, admit that I am glad that something is being done rather than nothing at all. But my university, the University of Georgia, became the first university on the planet where you could be certified in the ISO standard, the 3415 standard that I mentioned to you before, in an online course anywhere around the world, because it's got 162 signatories now, unless it's going up, which is incredible to me. I mean, I remember when it was just a conversation on the phone, and now they have 162 countries signed on to it. Sign on for this course that's offered by the University of Georgia. And there were not enough of those things around that addressed sort of the formal parts of it. And once people saw that it became kind of a thing, they started throwing up these programs that really didn't have an awful lot of substance to them. But you got a notification that said you knew diversity. So I would say, aside from all of that nonsense, what I would urge people who do this work to do is to, number one, ground yourself in the issues, and don't just listen to anybody's nonsense, because people started coming out with stuff, and some of it's good, some of it's not. And hopefully through grounding yourself, you can figure out
The
what
good.
is worth
Yeah.
listening to and
Bad.
what's good. Secondly, it and I can't stress this enough, how important it is to bring your authentic self to what it is you do. Be
Yeah.
open, be vulnerable. Your audience will meet you where you are. If you walk in and you're very stiff and formal, that's the way they're going to be, because we're trained in doing that, right? We're
Yeah.
social creatures. We do whatever the leader is going to do, and they consider us a leader if we're standing in front of the class. So, be comfortable in your space and work to make sure that you are. Okay, figure out what
Yes.
makes you uncomfortable about it, and then
Right.
get rid of it. Because when you walk in that door, you are theirs, and it's not about you. It's not about ego. It's about you being out there to teach them what it is
Yes.
being open to taking in the learning that goes
Nations.
on at the same time on your part. So
Yeah.
much of what I've gotten for any presentation I do has come from being willing to understand that I learn as much from them as they do from me.
Yeah.
And I have to provide that space that allows that to happen, for them to understand it's a two-way street. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm up here and I'm the one doing this, but what you have in your head matters tremendously to not only me, but to the other people in this room, because we're all learning this new territory together. If you can't get past your own discomfort of
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is, public speaking or being in a group or having somebody expect you to know something that you feel like you don't know as well as you should, you
Yes.
need to deal with that. Also,
Yeah. That
never,
way.
people pick up stuff really quickly. Somebody asked me the other day,
Mm.
what would you do if someone, I was meeting with an organization that was trying to get a program together, and they said, what would you do? What do you do when people are resistant? And, I'm doing a presentation. And I said, I'm sorry to tell you, or maybe I'm not, but I've simply never had that happen. I mean, nobody, stands up and challenges me in some way that I can't handle. I understand that people are in all different kinds of places when they come to see me, but when you leave me, we're all in the same place,
On the same
because what
page.
I've given you has given you a new place to start from. And
Yeah.
probably, if I could think of one time it happened, it was when I hadn't even opened my mouth, and this was part of what I referred to in the TED Talk. I got ready to take the stage, and he stands up and says, I hope this isn't about those homosexuals, because I'm not going to, this is against the Bible, and I'm not going to do that. And that's
Okay.
probably the closest anybody has ever come to sort of challenging me, but it wasn't a challenge to me because I hadn't even said anything yet, right? That was really a challenge for your employer.
It was just
And
making an assumption.
yeah.
Oh
Oh, yeah,
my God.
absolutely. And I have to know that people do that coming into the room. So I have to very quickly shut all of that down before I
Yes.
even open my mouth. Before I even
Uh,
open, I mean, literally, and this is very good for people who are coming into this to know, all of what it is that you bring to this, your countenance, your tone of voice, your body language, all becomes a part of what people are going to take as part of the message, right? So if you're
yeah.
uptight, they're going to feel that, they're going to be uptight. If you're open and you're taking
Open.
it lightly, although it's serious stuff, that's the way they're going to do. And that opens their mind up to be able to hear you, because
Yeah.
they're so busy building this wall that you have helped to create. So,
Mm-hmm.
when he said that, I just, said, well, good morning to you too. But this is, your employer is the one who asked me to come here and talk about this. So, you need to deal with your employer if you have a problem with what we do by the end of the day, because your employer is really concerned. And then, the whole idea of thinking you can custom tailor a workplace to be what you want it to be, only the
Yeah,
people you want to be around. I mean, that just sort of doesn't make any sense. And
that's
when you come
not
to me with religious stuff, that doesn't make any sense either, because why would you just pick that one thing out as opposed to picking out people who cheat on their wives or cheat on their taxes or, disrespect their mother and father? I mean, all of those are not supposed to be done under the Bible.
Yeah.
You quoted to me. And then, I told him the last one, I'm just sort of concerned about why you got hired and you're doing your job and you're thinking about other people's sex lives. Like, what's that about?
Yes.
And,
That's got to do with you.
by the time I finished, I mean, he just, everybody was laughing and he had to too. And he said,
Just lightened it up.
That way. I hadn't thought about that, but that makes a whole lot of sense. And then he just said it and was like, thank you.
So looking ahead, what initiatives or areas within DEI are you excited to explore or focus on?
I am really so taken now with two things. One, how to deal with pushback on diversity.
Right.
It has taken on dimensions that never occurred to me before.
Okay.
Given my country's history of discrimination. So anything you do that's going to, deal with that, you're always going to get pushback. Mm-hmm. The other thing is the creativity that, because diversity and the things about it are not going to go away, because basically take all the stuff away, take all the politics away, take everything away, and all you're talking about, I don't care what country you're in, all you're talking about is respecting people for who they are. That's all we're talking about, right? So whether it's based on race or gender or sexual orientation, or the fact that you come from a different tribe or you come from a different religion, when you're in the workplace, all of that is secondary to the fact that you have been hired to do a job, and the people who are there with you doing that job, you are under usually the employer's policies supposed to respect them. Okay. Now, whatever gets in the way of that, you need to handle, because that's not their problem. That's your problem. And you need to deal with it as your problem. Okay. One of the things that, one of the ways that I bring this up in my sessions is that I ask people what it would feel like. Does anybody like love? Yes, they do. Everybody loves it. What would it feel like if you felt loved at work? And they tell me all these things that they would feel. I would feel respected, and I would feel valued. I'd feel seen. I'd feel heard. I'd feel protected. How would you know you feel those things? And when I say that, you have to think of specifics. When somebody does this, I feel that way.
Right.
The question becomes, first of all, I love it because we all know how to do all of that, because there are people that we do that for every day. So I'm not trying to get you to learn how to do anything new. But the other piece of that is, why aren't we doing it for everyone? And we're not doing it for everyone is because of those messages that we have received. We have learned that there are some people that are worthy of that love and other people that are not. And we haven't really thought about that in that way. But it's true. And it absolutely ends up being manifested in the workplace. So for me, deciding how we're going to work with this issue of how to respect people despite all of the political stuff and the pushback about it becomes a really important piece. And we are so creative as humanity that I want to see how we deal with it. Century in June of this year, June 29th, the Supreme Court, the highest court, issued a decision on affirmative action, which was a concept of intentional inclusion of groups that had traditionally been excluded. But it was in the context of higher education.
Okay.
But, we know that it's coming down the line for workplaces as well. Schools are not going to go back on that concept. I mean, once you understand what it means to deal with diversity and inclusion and make sure that you have everybody who's there or could be there accepted for who they are, you're not going to all of a sudden say, oh, okay, we don't have to do that anymore. I'm good. What you need to do, because you know it now, is exactly what they're doing. You're going to figure a way around that decision. You're going to figure a way that you can legally do what it is that you were trying to do by doing this. And I'm excited about what people are going to do that. I love the idea of how creative they are, and that we've gotten to a point where people want to be able to respect each other.
Yes.
One of the biggest delights for me in a session is people learning what's in their head and how they've been using it in ways that have excluded people. Now, it sounds like that would be something negative that people wouldn't want to know. But as it turns out, and I don't ever ask them that, okay, they come forward and say it. And it is amazing what they do. I was in a session week before last where it was an international company, and somebody who had come from Ireland talked about the messages he received on the basis of race. And what he talked about, he was white. And he talked about being in high school and having a really good Black friend. And when him and his friend met up with some other white Irish folks, teenagers, they were just teenagers at the time.
Yes.
They called him really negative names. They called the Black guy really negative names. He talked about how awful he felt because he never said anything about it. And that was his good friend. And he started to tear up. And there wasn't a person in the room that did not feel his pain, that did not feel, instead of saying, oh, that was really awful that you didn't do that. Everybody was like, we've all had those moments. We did not stand in the breach like we know we should. I never told him to say that. I didn't ask him, tell me the worst thing you ever did. That came to him. That came to him when I simply said, what messages did you receive growing up about race? And think about it. What he told me wasn't a message he had received. They were actions he had done, but he now understood why he had done those things. And that's not who he wanted to be. That's where the tears came from.
Oh, I see.
Later, he was regretting what he had done. And now that he understood why he did it, it made him feel a sense of relief that everybody could benefit from by hearing that story. And I love it that he was willing to tell that story.
Share it, yeah. Dawn, I could talk to you forever about this amazing issue that we have in front of us. I don't have the words to thank you for this interview. The depth of knowledge that you have is just absolutely incredible. And I really feel honored that you are now in my tribe. I have a sister that I can lean on when I need the resources to do the work in this part of the world as well.
So only an email away.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I've got your website scrolling at the bottom of the screen. If anybody wants more information, please reach out. And do come back again tomorrow. The Diversity Connector is a platform that is connecting people from all walks of life so we can share these experiences, these stories, to create a bridge between cultures and get to understand each other as a race. So do come back again tomorrow when I interview yet another amazing guest. In the meantime, have a fantastic day, morning, or evening, wherever you are in the world. And bye for now. Thanks again, Ms. Dawn.
All right.
And that's a wrap, everybody, on today's episode of the Diversity Connector podcast. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our vibrant and global conversation. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and it's been an honor to share this space with you, where voices from all walks of life come together to weave a tapestry of diverse perspectives. Remember, every story you've heard today is a thread in the larger fabric of our shared humanity. So, as you step back into your world, carry these stories with you and let them inspire you to embrace and celebrate the rich diversity around us. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help us share these inspiring stories with more listeners. Do follow us on social media by looking for the Diversity Connector podcast for more updates. Until then, keep connecting, keep listening, and keep celebrating the beauty of diversity. This is the Diversity Connector podcast signing off. Stay curious, stay open, and definitely